Trump's Donroe Doctrine backfires, and Canada's response changes everything. On January 3, 2026, something happened that fundamentally altered the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. In the early hours of the morning, United States military forces entered Venezuela. Within hours, American troops had seized military installations across the country. Helicopter-borne units descended into Caracas, and before dawn, Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife were taken from their residence and flown out of the country. By the end of the day, both were in U.S. custody, facing drug trafficking charges in New York. This was not covert, it was not denied, it was not ambiguous. It was the most direct American military intervention in Latin America since the U.S. invasion of Panama in 1989. A sovereign head of state was removed by force and brought to the United States to face American courts. Without United Nations authorization, without international approval, and without even the pretense of multilateral consensus. And then Donald Trump stepped in front of the cameras at Mar-a-Lago and made it official. He announced what he called the Donroe Doctrine, a rebranding and expansion of the 200-year-old Monroe Doctrine, and declared that the United States would reassert absolute dominance over the entire Western Hemisphere. Then he said something that should have sent shockwaves through every capital from Ottawa to Buenos Aires. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. The State Department followed with a statement just as blunt. This is our hemisphere, and President Trump will not allow our security to be threatened. Those words matter, because when Trump says our hemisphere, he isn't just talking about Venezuela. Canada is in that hemisphere. Greenland is in that hemisphere. The Panama Canal is in that hemisphere. And Trump has already made clear that he wants influence, if not control, over all of them. But here's what no one expected. Within 72 hours of Trump's declaration, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney began making moves that stunned diplomats, analysts, and even America's closest allies. Moves that signaled Canada is no longer operating under the assumptions that govern North American politics for the last 80 years. This is the story of how the United States declared itself supreme over its neighbors, and how Canada responded by quietly building an entirely new alliance system to protect itself. What really happened in Venezuela? To understand why this moment matters so much, especially for Canada, you have to understand what the Venezuela operation represented. Operation Absolute Resolve was not framed as peacekeeping. It was not framed as humanitarian intervention. It was framed as enforcement. Trump's administration announced that the United States would oversee Venezuela's political transition until further notice. American companies were granted access to Venezuela's oil reserves, the largest proven reserves on Earth. And then Trump invoked the Monroe Doctrine. But he didn't stop there. He declared that the Monroe Doctrine was outdated and that it had been replaced by something stronger. They now call it the Donroe Doctrine. Trump said, "We've superseded it by a lot, by a real lot." This wasn't rhetoric, it was policy. In November 2025, just weeks before the Venezuela operation, the Trump administration released a new national security strategy. Buried inside it was a formal Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The document explicitly states that the United States will reassert and enforce its dominance in the Western Hemisphere to restore American preeminence. It goes further. It declares that non-hemispheric powers, meaning China, Russia, and others, will be denied the ability to own or control strategically vital assets anywhere in the Americas. And it demands that American allies in the region wind down adversarial outside influence as a condition of continued partnership. Translation: countries like Canada must choose between Washington and Beijing or face consequences. Why Canada is directly in the crosshairs. This is where the story stops being theoretical, because Canada isn't just an ally, it is strategically indispensable. The Canadian Arctic contains vast reserves of critical minerals, rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, essential to semiconductors, batteries, defense systems, and advanced weapons. The Northwest Passage, a shipping route through Canadian Arctic waters, is becoming one of the most strategically valuable corridors on Earth as ice melts, and Canada controls it. Washington has never accepted Canada's claim that the Northwest Passage is internal Canadian waters. The U.S. insists it's an international strait. For decades, that disagreement was managed quietly. The 1988 Arctic Cooperation Agreement required American icebreakers to seek Canadian consent before transiting. Trump's national security strategy effectively declares that arrangement finished. It calls for continued access to key strategic locations and the ability to assert ourselves with confidence where and when necessary. In plain terms, the United States no longer intends to ask permission. One Washington analyst put it bluntly: the U.S. cannot afford to let Canadian consent be a condition for access. That isn't speculation. That's doctrine. The escalation didn't stop with Venezuela. Within days of the Venezuela operation, Trump administration officials made clear this was only the beginning. Secretary of State Marco Rubio went on television and said, "This is the Western Hemisphere. This is where we live, and we're not going to allow it to be a base of operations for adversaries." When asked about Colombia, Trump responded, "Sounds good to me." He threatened Cuba. He warned Mexico's president to watch his ass. He described Colombia as very sick. Then came Greenland. Stephen Miller, one of Trump's closest advisors, posted an image of Greenland draped in an American flag with a single word: soon. When asked whether military force was on the table against Greenland, a NATO territory, the administration refused to rule it out. That prompted Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen to issue one of the most extraordinary statements ever made by a NATO leader about the United States. If the United States were to move against another NATO country, she said, that would be the end of NATO as we know it. Let that sink in. A founding NATO member publicly discussing the possibility of American military aggression against an ally. This is the world Trump created. Canada realizes it's on the menu. Trump has repeatedly referred to Canada as the 51st state. He imposed punishing tariffs on Canadian goods. He mocked former Prime Minister Trudeau as a governor. And now his national security doctrine explicitly places Canada inside an American sphere of dominance. Former Canadian UN Ambassador Bob Rae didn't mince words after Venezuela. The Americans are saying things that undermine our future and dictate our future in a way that puts us in an impossible position. Former Foreign Affairs Minister Lloyd Axworthy warned, "If we allow Trump to do whatever he wants to, whomever he wants, then we are vulnerable." The Eurasia Group, one of the world's most respected political risk firms, ranked the Donroe Doctrine as the third largest global risk of 2026, and they were explicit. No country outside the U.S. will be more affected by Trump's revolution than Canada. They concluded bluntly, Canada's long-standing relationship with the U.S. is history. Carney's quiet, strategic response. Prime Minister Mark Carney's first public reaction to Venezuela was measured, diplomatic, careful. Critics called it weak. But while Carney was cautious with words, he was bold with actions. Within days, he flew to Paris, not to meet Americans, but to meet European allies at a coalition of the willing summit on Ukraine. Standing beside Danish Prime Minister Frederiksen, Carney made a move heavy with symbolism. He announced that Canada's Governor-General, Mary Simon, who is Inuk, would visit Greenland. Canada would also open a new consulate in Nuuk. The message was unmistakable. Canada was standing with Greenland, not Washington. Carney said it plainly. The future of Greenland is a decision for Greenland and Denmark alone. Canada then joined France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Spain, and the UK in a joint statement affirming Greenland's sovereignty, directly contradicting American threats. This was not symbolic resistance. This was alliance building. Canada joins Europe's defense architecture. But Carney went further. Canada committed to European-led security guarantees for Ukraine involving over 35 countries, a coalition independent of U.S. leadership. And this wasn't new. In December 2025, Canada became the first non-European country in history to join the EU's flagship defense program, SAFE, Security Action for Europe. SAFE is a $150 billion rearmament program designed to rebuild Europe's military capacity. Under the agreement Carney negotiated, Canadian firms can bid on EU military contracts. Canada can join joint weapons procurement at scale. European defense investment can flow into Canada, and Carney made it explicit. Over 70 cents of every Canadian defense dollar will no longer go to the United States. That is a seismic shift. The UK tried and failed to join SAFE. Canada succeeded. That tells you everything. Canada rearms. For the Arctic, Carney's first budget included $81.8 billion in new defense funding over 5 years. Canada committed immediately to NATO's 2% target and accepted the alliance's new goal of 5% by 2035, roughly $150 billion annually. Much of it is aimed at Arctic defense. $420 million for Arctic troop presence, $1 billion for dual-use northern infrastructure, new submarines and icebreakers, Arctic surveillance systems, NORAD modernization at $38.6 billion. U.S. Coast Guard officials have confirmed their new Arctic cutters are based on Canadian designs. The irony is unmistakable. The U.S. is relying on Canadian technology while threatening Canadian sovereignty. The strategic triangle. Trump didn't anticipate Trump's doctrine demands Canada cut ties with China. Instead, Trump's aggression pushed Canada closer to Europe and reopened dialogue with Beijing. In October 2025, Carney met Xi Jinping. The first such meeting since 2017. Carney was blunt. We have too many eggs in the American basket. His goal, double Canada's non-U.S. trade within a decade. Analysts describe Canada's dilemma as an impossible triangle: maintain U.S. ties, pursue China diversification, and preserve sovereignty. Carney chose sovereignty, the collapse of the old order. Trump's national security strategy explicitly rejects the post-1945 international order. It rejects open trade, collective security, democracy promotion. It replaces them with spheres of influence. This is 19th century geopolitics, revived in the 21st century. But Trump miscalculated. His aggression is accelerating alliance building without America. Europe is rearming. Canada is integrating with Europe. Middle powers are hedging. As one diplomat put it, we either hang together or we hang separately.